Hey, it's Ruth here from Christchurch, New Zealand. Now, after talking a little bit about my worm farm in a previous video, I've had a few people asking me to explain a little bit more and to show a little bit more about my worm farm. So in this video I'm going to explain my worm farm and then to show you how I use some of the worm castings and some of the worm tea. In my worm farm I currently have 3 boxes. When I started with just this bottom one and this middle one, and this is the one where you really fill up first, and then when that one gets filled you can add a third one on the top. So this is where most of the worms are currently living. This is where I add in all the food. This one is where I'm storing my worm castings and they're composting a little bit more. And this bottom one is where all the liquid goes into, and then it comes out as worm tea. I collect it in a milk bottle, which makes it really easy, and use it in the garden. To use it in the garden I put it in a watering can and water it down with some normal tap water so that it looks like a real weak tea. And it always depends on how much it's been raining and how much water's been added as to how much water I need to add. At first I was always doing a 1:10 ratio, but quickly learnt that sometimes if there's been too much water in this one, especially if it's raining because water still gets down in here, this can be quite weak and it doesn't need to be a 1:10 ratio. If we come up, well, I'll put the lid on first. I've made the mistake before of not putting the lid on and then knocking it over, and all that good worm tea is lost. Don't want that to happen. So up the top, lid to protect them from birds really, and inside is my bit of carpet, and this is a very technical gadget. It is an old peg from some weed cloth, and this is what I use just to dig around, especially when I don't always have my gloves on because I'm not a big fan of getting lots of worms on my hands. Here's a couple of the little good guys. And what I use this for is every now and then I just kind of dig up in it just to aerate the soil to make sure it doesn't get too stuck down, and to move the worms around a little bit. You can see there's lots of little areas of worms. It's quite exciting really. Even if you don't like bugs, you might get interested in worms. And what I do is add at the start probably about a cup of food a day, and now I just kind of go with the flow and see how much the worms are eating. In summer they are reproducing more and eating more, so I can add more food, and in winter I tend to add a little bit less. As I said in my other video, I've got some of the white worms which I'm just trying to combat at the moment. They're not actually a massive problem, but they're because either I've fed them too much or it's a bit too acidic. If the food in here starts getting mouldy, that's definitely when you've been feeding them too much. Just give a little bit more dig round. See, so many different little populations of worms, which is really quite cool. So this is where all the worms really are living. What I'm going to do is, I can't pick up this one-handed, so I'm just going to turn it off and take off the top layer so that I can show you inside the second layer. Okay, so I've taken off my top layer. If you can see, just down here is a black middle bit. This bit has some holes in it so that the worms can get through the different layers. And this is where all the worm castings are. It's quite low because I have been taking bits out of here, but this is where it's all the composted food, and there are a few little worms still living in here. So whenever I go and put this in the garden, I always end up bringing a bucket with me to put the worms back in the worm farm. Because these are tiger worms and not normal earthworms, they live in the top section of the soil rather than the bottom, and they really eat the decaying fruit and vegetables rather than the soil. So they don't live that well in the soil. So they'll end up going back in here, and I'm going to use this to go over and give it to my Brussels sprouts so that they can get some awesome energy. I'm going to take this one off so I can show you the bottom as well. So now we have currently the middle box, the top box, and this is the bottom box, which always stays at the bottom. These are the holes that I was talking about earlier, so that the worms can get up and down the levels. And in here there is a big pot in the middle, and that is so that if any worms do happen to drop down, they can find their way back up and then get back up the top holes, but also it does hold the weight. And this is where all the worm tea is kept, which then when I release it, it comes out of here. And I try and release it pretty often because I don't want it to get all the way up to the top, because I don't know, I just feel like the worms might drown, it's a bit too much water. So always try and maybe once a week or so empty a milk bottle full of worm tea and then put it straight on the garden. So let's head over to where I need to go. Here I am now with my worm castings and with my Brussels sprouts. So this is where I'm going to be adding in my worm castings today, and I'm going to show you how big they currently are because it quite excites me. I haven't really grown Brussels sprouts before. I tried last year following a planting guide and it said to plant the seedlings in June. Currently it's June and they didn't really get that far by the end of the year. There was leaves, there's definitely no Brussels sprouts. So I planted these a couple of months ago, can't quite remember when, and this is the size of them now. And if you have a look down here, you can see the little Brussels sprouts. I never realised that they grew on the stem from where the leaves joined the plant. I always thought, I don't know, like they grew on the stem. Didn't realise where they grew. So these ones have got pretty good ones. So this is the worm castings, and what I'm going to do is, you don't actually need that much. It's kind of a tablespoon per plant really, but it's quite potent stuff. I'm just going to put it around the base, and then I'm just going to mix it in a little bit, and do that for every plant, so that every plant gets a little bit more nutrients. And then I'm going to use a little bit of worm tea just to water it in, and also while I'm doing that, give some worm tea to the rest of the garden. So that's my worm farm, that's how I'm using it. Good luck with yours if you've got one, and if you don't have one, start one. They're really easy. Everyone has kitchen scraps, and if you know anyone with a worm farm, I definitely recommend asking them if they've got any that they can share with you.